Hey y'all, welcome to another canning video. So I'm going to show y'all how to make some spaghetti sauce. I'm also going to include a fail I had in this video. So stay tuned to the end of this video and you'll see that I'm not perfect at this, but it is okay. I'm learning, constantly learning as I go, and I'm continuing to press forward. I've learned something every single time I pressure can this year, and probably learned the most in this video that y'all are about to see. So I am in the midst of canning season, and I want to offer you this tutorial for you to look back to, just to be on my channel on pressure canning. I'm gonna walk y'all through how we put our sauce together, how we fill the jars, how we put them in the canner, how we look at this gauge and this regulator and the vent pipe and locking the top and everything, how long to let steam escape, how long to let pressure build, how to time it. I'm gonna walk you through all of that. So this may be a longer video, so stick with me. I'll have timestamps down below for you to refer to if you need to look at a specific part or you want to rewatch a specific part. I know when I was first watching videos, I would go back and rewatch specific parts. So let's just talk about why would you want to pressure can. So I know some people might say, well, I prefer to water bath can. I don't want to fool with a pressure canner, which is fine. But there are certain foods that have to be pressure canned. It's not a matter of your preference, it's a matter of food safety. So foods that have a low acidity, so lots of vegetables, green beans, potatoes, corn, carrots, any vegetable, meat, dairy, broths, those are going to have to be pressure canned because they have little to no acidity in them to be able to water bath can. So when you water bath can, you will either need to use an acidic fruit, add some sort of citrus like lime or lemon, or you can also sometimes add citric acid or like a pectin for jams and jelly. So definitely look into more specifics on whatever food you want to can, if you can water bath can it or if it has to be pressure canned. So there were so many foods I was missing out on canning before I had this pressure canner. So I was very excited to get it this year. It sat in my pantry for about 4 months before I actually pulled it out. I was so nervous to use it. You can see my first raw and real experience pressure canning a few videos back. I'll link it below for y'all if you want to watch my raw and real nervousness in my first time using this machine. So this is going to be more of a tutorial, me talking about the machine, how we used it. We're going to be making some tomato sauce in this video. So again, you will need to check your food specifications either online or the Ball canning book, some sort of canning reference on what is required for safely canning your food, because there's certain foods that have to come to that certain pressure for a certain amount of time to safely seal that can and make sure it's sustainable for long-term food storage. So let's just talk about the canner. So this is my pressure canner. I have the Presto pressure canner. The other brands, this is just the most affordable one and one that we wanted to start with for our first pressure canning experience. So this is the 23 quart. I believe this is the largest one that they have. I could be wrong. I know there's a smaller one, but this one will hold 7 quart jars, and I haven't actually used pints in here, but it will probably hold 7 to 10. I'm not exactly sure. Let me know down below if you can tell us how many pints this will hold, because I've only pressure canned quarts in this. You have the large stock pot, which this almost looks just like a normal stock pot, but it has this locking mechanism that is very important, because that is how you're going to, talking into this canner, that is how your lid is going to safely lock. Some people are terrified of pressure canning. They've heard stories of the top flying off and glass exploding everywhere and people dying of explosions. That's just not true anymore. They make these things very, very safe now. So this is the lock that's going to lock into your lid here, making sure that everything is safe and secure. Here it says open and close. I don't know if y'all can see that, but that arrow will match this arrow when you lock on your pressure can. So this is your lid. This is what will lock into place, and once it's locked, it is not moving, and it gets very, very hot. So don't try to take it off. Don't try to move it until this thing has been completely cooled off. I actually have a recent scar from using this machine. I tried to take off my lid too soon. It had lost all its pressure. We'll talk about the gauge in a second, but the pressure was completely gone, but it was still very, very hot. And I went to twist off the lid and my arm bumped this metal part, and it is super, super hot. So don't let kids get near this. Be very careful when you are touching the pressure canner if it's not all the way cool. So back to what I was saying, this is your lid. You have a few parts up here that I'm going to talk to you about. So I already talked to you about the locking part that will lock under the actual pot canner. Then you have the ring in here, the rubber gasket. This gasket comes out. It is recommended that you periodically take this out, clean it, add some oil to it just to keep it properly working. This is to keep a tight seal on your pressure canner. Then you have this little mechanism. This is the air vent lock. So when you first put your pressure canner lid on, it'll be hot and you'll start to hear this thing start rattling, kind of like this. It'll be rattling, and you'll have steam coming out the vent pipe, and it's letting you know that air is escaping, air is still escaping, it's getting to pressure. Once your pressure is built up and you start to see pressure building on your gauge, this air vent will lock into place and you will not see it wiggling anymore. It's just locked into place. This little black thing is a safety mechanism. If the air vent ever becomes clogged and air can't release when needed, this will automatically pop out as a safety mechanism to allow air to release. This is the vent pipe. So once you first put your canner on and you start letting the pressure build, you're not going to put the regulator on this, which I'll show you in a minute, and you'll start to see steam coming out of this vent pipe. This is how steam escapes. If you have an Instant Pot or if you've used an Instant Pot in the past, there's also a vent seal on the back of it that you twist open or close. It's very similar in the way that steam escapes. This is the pressure gauge. So you can see it has different numbers. This is your pressure, PSI, pounds per square inch of pressure that's built up in your pressure canner. So different foods will need different PSIs to properly can them and preserve that food. And also I don't live at an elevation, so I just follow all the general guidelines for canning. But if you live in a different elevation, you'll need to check and see how much pressure you will need to add to that number to safely can your food products. I've also read that these can become uncalibrated. I need to look into that. Mine is brand new. I've only been using it this season, so I hope mine is not uncalibrated yet. But I read a story of a lady who was canning foods and her calibration was off by 2 pounds, and that really affected her canning and her food preservation. So I need to look into that. I have not yet. I actually was just reading this story yesterday about the blog post I was reading about the lady whose gauge was uncalibrated. So check into that. I'll try to find that reference down below on how to recalibrate your gauge, or I know there's gauges you can also take this off. You can take this off right here with this bolt and put a different type of gauge on here that doesn't have to be calibrated. So again, I'm new to that. I have not researched that fully, but this is your pressure gauge, which is what you will actually be watching when you start your canning, and I'll talk to you about that once we start our sauce. This last piece on the lid is the regulator. So this is what will trap in that steam and that pressure once the timing should begin for pressure canning. So I will walk y'all through when to put this on and when to put this off when we start our canning process, but this is removable. Also, when you take your lid off of your canner, make sure you take that off. I've had this fall off many, many times when I take off this lid and just pop it open, how this fly across my kitchen. So this comes on and off. This is the regulator to regulate that pressure. It will slightly wiggle like this when your canning is going on, just from that pressure pushing through, but it shouldn't be like super, super loud. Okay, last thing that I want to show y'all is in this big stock pot. This is the canning rack tray that comes with the canner. So water bath canners often come with a rack as well. This is the rack for the pressure canner. If you happen to not have this, maybe you have a hand-me-down canner or you've lost yours, you can also just stack rings, mason jar rings. Let me grab a couple and show y'all. I have done this once when I was water bath canning because I don't have a true water bath canner. I usually just use a towel in the bottom of my pot, but I have done this one time. So you will layer your jar lids, if you can see that, down in the bottom of your canner, and that will act as your rack. So you will just spread them across there. Hope y'all can see this. Spread those across there, and that will keep your jars from touching the bottom of your canner. Although I've used this, I recommend, hopefully yours has this. But like I said, if you have a hand-me-down from a family member, because several years ago, 50, 60 years ago, most people had pressure canners and they pressure can their food. My mom actually just found my grandmother's pressure canner. It was about half this size, and it will pressure can pints. So she's gonna bring it to me soon and I'm gonna try it out. But I didn't know that when I got this pressure canner. I would have loved to have had her hand-me-down one. But anyways, if you have a hand-me-down canner and it just doesn't have this, you can always do the mason jar ring trick, because if you're canning, you're gonna have lots of these. If you're using American jars, like Ball or Kerr, those types of jars. So you're going to want something on the bottom of your canner to keep the jars from touching the hot bottom of that canner, because this canner is going to get super, super hot. There's going to be water bubbling, pressure building, and you don't want to risk your jars touching the bottom of that can, because they need a barrier from that hot bottom. This kind of serves as that barrier. So hopefully that will help you with terminology and being familiar with the parts of the pressure canner. I know it helped me to know what this part was called and how to properly use it. All this will be in your canner handbook manual, but I always find it helpful to watch videos and see other people using these products and equipment before I actually use it myself. So now let's talk about some canning equipment you'll need. Of course, you're gonna need jars. I have, typically to can, I use quarts, pints, and half pints. I honestly prefer wide mouth when possible because they're just easier to clean. You can get your hand down in there better and clean them, but I do use regular mouth when I run out of wide mouth. Half pints I have not used in the pressure canner because typically I do jellies and jams in this, and jellies and jams can be water bath canned. You're also going to need lids. I just always pick up these, my husband as well, when we're out and about and we see lids, we always just grab some, because technically you're not supposed to reuse your lids, because this seal, this red seal, is what adheres to the glass and forms that tight seal for your food safety. I'll admit though, I have tested here lately trying to reuse some lids and have had some success and have had some not successful. So I just recommend getting new lids. But if you're ever in like a shortage and we can't buy lids, it might be nice to have some used lids that you've taken off of canned foods. I do save those in my pantry, and I have separate containers for new lids and used lids that have been recycled, just in case. But I did, like I said, I wanted to do a test this year on reusing some lids and seeing if they sealed. So I had some successfully seal, and then I had a couple that did not. So those that did not had to be put in my fridge, and the food has to be used up pretty quickly, within a month or so. So anyways, I always just pick these up when I see them. They're not the cheapest as they used to be. These used to be really, really cheap, but as more people have started canning and preserving, which is wonderful, I think they just marketed the price up on these. So anyways, I always have these on hand and use a new lid when canning, just to ensure they're gonna get a proper seal. You're also going to need some rings, which I already talked to you about. So rings, you can reuse these over and over and over and over and over. You don't have to rebuy these each year. We have tons and tons of rings. I'm actually looking for a new solution to store our rings, because right now I just have them in a huge bowl, and that bowl is overflowing because I have so many of these. So that is going to be the supplies for the actual jars. There's also a few products I recommend for actually canning, and I've talked about this before. This is a jar lifter. This will easily allow you to lift your jars up and down from the canner. These are going to be hot when you hold them, when you put them in, when you take them out, when you put them on your counter. They're going to be hot. You can't just pick them up. You will have a burnt hand. Now, I've heard people use tongs. I don't recommend it. I tried using tongs my first year water bath canning, and I had like a towel in between the tong, and I was trying to hold it like this, and it was a disaster. Jars were slipping. This is just not as secure. So if you're in a pinch, you could probably make this work with a towel and just being very, very, very careful. Although I highly recommend getting a jar lifter. These are less than $10 and they're so convenient, so secure. Highly recommend a lifter. You're also going to want a funnel. This is just when packing food. It makes packing food a lot easier. Now, I still have a plastic one because this is what I started out with when I first got into canning. I want to get a stainless steel one because of just looks nicer. I'll admit that it just looks nicer than this bright blue one, and it also is going to hold up better in the constant hot foods going in and out of this, and just the wear and tear of the plastic, and we just generally try not to use a lot of plastic. So this is something I will hopefully be replacing pretty soon with a stainless steel one. You can buy kits on like Amazon or in like your local co-op, Tractor Supply, canning kits that will come with lifters and funnels and rings. Many times though, the products in those kits are not as high high quality. They're not going to be stainless steel. They're probably going to be plastic, kind of like this. So I would recommend just buying these couple things individually, either at your local store or on Amazon. So those are some supplies you're going to need. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything else. And then of course you're going to need your food that you're canning. So in this video, we're going to be canning tomato sauce. I have lots and lots and lots of beautiful tomatoes that we grew in our garden this year. This is our first year to successfully grow enough tomatoes for me to can sauces and salsa, and us also to have some for just some delicious sandwiches. So that is what we're going to be canning in this video, is tomato sauce. I'll walk you through the recipe. We're going to need some tomatoes, carrots, onions, peppers, seasonings, whatever spices you want, a little bit of red wine. I'll walk you through all of that in this video. But so as far as making the tomato sauce, I basically just grab my ingredients and start chopping. So I'm going to add tomatoes. Of course, you could skip the peeling of the tomatoes. I am blanching my tomatoes here in boiling hot water for about 2 to 3 minutes. Then I pull them out and the skin will easily peel off. I remember my mom talking about blanching tomatoes with my grandmother when she was little, and my grandmother doing this. So it's just a process that takes a little extra time, but I timed it when I was filming this for you guys, and this whole entire batch of tomatoes took me 25 minutes to actually peel and take the skins off and take out the core. So you could leave the peels on. The original recipe I found, they actually did leave their peels on, but they still have to chop their tomatoes and core them. So honestly, you're still chopping the tomato, you're still touching the tomato. You might as well just blanch it and peel the skin off. We're going to be blending everything together at the end, so the peels will get pureed, but you will occasionally find that little bitty piece of a peel in your sauce, and my family is not quite a fan of that. So I try to get the peels off by blanching them and pulling them off. If you leave a few peels, it's not gonna matter. Like I said, most of them will puree up when we blend this at the very end. That's how I prepare my tomatoes. Then I core the inside, put them into the pot, and just keep adding them in. I do periodically pour the juice that's coming off as I'm coring them into my stock pot for when I'm cooking the sauce. If you don't want a very juicy sauce, I have noticed that this creates a juicier sauce. If you don't want that much juice, just don't pour this juice back in. Sauce has always been one of my goals, is to have enough tomato sauce to last us through the year for spaghetti sauce, pizzas, any type of marinara. But this will probably be the first year that we've had more than like 10 quarts, because we grew so many tomatoes this year. That was my ultimate goal, and my husband made that happen. He planted so many tomato plants for us. So I realized that buying tomato sauce is really pretty cheap, honestly, compared to many things. But you can't compare to making something homegrown. And not to mention, most tomato sauces this flies everywhere. Most tomato sauces in the grocery stores do have added preservatives in them that we try to avoid. We found one we like from Thrive Market, but it's not as cheap. It's not as convenient just to order that all the time. Though I had relied on that Thrive Market tomato sauce for quite a while, but just wanted to share a little bit on homemade tomato sauce versus store-bought and why we prioritize that. Then we're going to add our other ingredients. Again, you can rough chop all of this. There is no need to perfectly finely chop all of this, because it's going to simmer and cook in this pot. This is just a regular stock pot, and I'm just putting all my ingredients in there to prepare them for the sauce. Next, we're going to add carrots. This is going to add a hint of sweetness to our sauce. Onions, peppers. If you had jalapenos, you could add that. Any peppers you like. You can add garlic, you can add spices, whatever you want in your sauce, you can just add it into here and let it simmer down for a couple of hours before you actually prepare the sauce for canning. So this recipe is very adaptable. I found tomato sauce very intimidating before I found this recipe, and just kind of toss things in, let it puree, and pour it up, and it's so easy. We're also going to be adding a splash of red wine. I add maybe 1/4 cup. And then lastly, to add a lot of flavor, I'm adding a beef bone. So we have bones all the time. We make bone broth, and just adding that beef bone in here will let the flavor cook in. Also add a lot of nutrients to your sauce. So I just toss it in here. It's only cooking for a couple of hours, so some of that nutrients is being pulled out, but there are some nutrients left, so I actually don't discard this bone just yet. So we're going to put everything in the pot. I'll leave the actual recipe down below, rough measurements for you guys. Put everything into the stock pot, put the lid on, and let it simmer. Then we're going to put everything into the blender and puree it. So I have a Vitamix. This purees very, very well. You can use an immersion blender. I tried that last year, but I don't have as high of a powered immersion blender. It's just one of like the $10 cheap ones. So it doesn't do the best of job at pureeing these tomatoes and carrots and peppers and garlic, and especially if you have some skins left, immersion blender I feel like doesn't get those skins very, very finely pureed. So I use my high powered Vitamix. You can use whatever blender source you have. Just puree it until you get a really good consistency for a tomato sauce. In the midst of all this, we're going to need to be getting our jars ready. So we are putting 3 quarts of water in the bottom of the canner, putting in our jars and getting them ready to add the food. So I'm placing my mason jars, my quart mason jars, into my pressure canner. They'll kind of probably fall over just a tad because there's no weight inside the jar to hold them down. You can always put a splash of water in them first to help hold them down. The regulator is not on, so no pressure is going to be building. It's just going to be strictly heating up, just like a regular stock pot would. So you will not see the gauge changing. No pressure is being built. This is strictly just warming and sterilizing my jars so that they're ready to have the sauce put in. Then we're going to get these filled up. I actually love using the blender because I can pour straight from the blender into my jars. I don't have to use a ladle or a measuring cup to dip it up. It is so important that you leave headspace. I have made the mistake and not left enough headspace in the past, and that will cause expansion during the canning process, and your seal will not. I have had jars sitting in my refrigerator because I did not seal, and I had to keep them refrigerated because I couldn't put them on a shelf because I overfilled my jars. So don't make that mistake. Always leave about an inch to half-inch headspace. You do want to give a quick wipe to your rims. Using the funnel will help with a lot of that mess getting on the rim, but always wipe it just to be safe. Now these lids are going on. Make sure that this seal is making contact with the glass and you don't have like a crooked lid on. And then rings will go fingertip tight. So you don't want to like really tighten it with all your strength. Just give it a quick turn, just slightly. Now, these are going to go back into the canner and wait for the rest of the batch to come in. These jars are made to withstand a lot of heat, but when they go from room temperature to extremely hot, or if they're going from extremely cold to extremely hot, they could break. You don't want to shock these jars. That's why we're warming them in the pressure canner first. Continue that process. I usually have to do this in 2 batches because my blender will only hold about half of this sauce. So I have a little extra, but I would not want to can this in a quart jar because it's not going to fill it. You don't want to can a half full jar because again, just the pressure changes, you could risk the chance of cracking a jar, and a jar of cracked spaghetti tomato sauce in the canner is not fun to clean up. So once everything's in the canner, here's where the lid comes on. So we're going to put on our lid, again, line up those arrows and then twist it towards you. There's going to be an open close lettering on the side of your canner letting you know which way to twist it when you're locking your canner into place. So once it is locked, you have nothing to worry about. It's not going to fly off. It's very safe as long as you're locking it properly. So we're going to put it on our eye. I put it at like medium high heat and let pressure start building. Once you see steam come out, start your timer for 10 minutes. This is letting pressure build and letting air get out of your canner so that there's only pressure in there, pounds of pressure, to actually can and process your food. So at this point, you're not going to see any changes on your gauge because you're not actually building pressure. You're just letting air escape and letting it get really hot so that when you put on the regulator, pressure will build pretty quickly. So at 10 minutes, here's where your regulator comes in. This is the part I was most nervous about, guys. I watched this part of the tutorial over and over and over. So if you want to come back and refer to this part, I'll have a timestamp on how to use the regulator because this was the most intimidating part for me personally. So you're going to take your regulator. So you're just going to gently pop it on there. And it's going to wiggle a lot. It's going to be catching all that steam, that pressure, and it's going to be kind of loud. And around this time, you're going to see this air lock pop up and lock into place. That is letting you know the air is pretty much out of the canner and it's ready to build pressure. And not long after, you're going to see your pressure gauge start to rise. This is not the time to walk out of your kitchen or to head outside or to get too busy and start multitasking and miss this step. The first time I pressure canned, I sat in my kitchen and watched this gauge the entire time I was canning because I was so nervous about missing a step and letting it get too hot or not get hot enough. This was the part I was just most nervous about, guys, but I haven't let you know that yet. So you're going to start seeing your pressure rise pretty quickly. It took mine maybe 10 minutes or so, but for my sauce, I'm canning it at 10 psi. So when it gets to 10 psi is when I want to set my timer for the processing time. So for my sauce, for quart jars, it's 90 minutes. at this point, you're gonna want to lower your burner because it's been really hot. It's getting that pressure built up. It's keeping that heat up. And if you keep it at that high heat, it's gonna just keep building pressure and pressure and pressure. And eventually you'll get to the 20, which is caution. You don't wanna get there. All you gotta do is stay in your kitchen and just watch your burner. If it starts getting a little bit high, lower your heat just a little. If it starts to drop a little, raise your heat a little, just adjust it accordingly. But stay in your kitchen and be close by. My timer just went off for 90 minutes, so I'm just going to turn off the heat. I'm not going to do anything else to the pressure canner. Turn it off and let it depressurize on its own. You don't want to remove the regulator. You don't want to move the canner around. You don't want to do anything to it. Just let it sit. It will depressurize within the hour. I've never actually timed it. I just watch for it to come back down to 0. And at that point is when you can take off the lid. However, if it just got to 0 and you try to take off this lid, it's probably not going to come off very easily because it's still very, very hot. I usually let it get to 0 and then give it another 30 or 40 minutes. That will ensure you don't get burnt, because one night it was really late and I was ready to get this lid off and get my cans out and get to bed. And that's when I was trying to open it too soon and got this nasty burn. So here is where you'll see my failure. And I opened my lid and saw spaghetti sauce everywhere, and that is never a good sight. I've never actually seen that. I've seen peaches splattered everywhere a couple years ago when I water bath canned because I had a jar break. But I've never seen anything in my pressure canner like this until I'm filming a video for you guys. So basically what happened is one of my lids completely came off. I do not know how that happened. I followed the regulations on making sure I didn't overfill my jars. If you overfill your jars, you can have an explosion. Now we're not overfilled. I don't know how this happened. Maybe it was just a defective lid. Things can happen. Don't be discouraged. You see here, I have a huge mess, but all of my jars were still properly sealed, minus that one jar that the lid did not stay on. I have no idea how that happened. So I had a big mess, but as you'll see, the next day I wiped them off. They're perfectly fine. Everything else sealed. Pull them out. Mine were very messy, as you see. Pull them out and you're probably gonna hear them start popping pretty quickly. And what's happening is this lid, there's a little button in the middle. You can kind of pop it like this. There's a button in the middle. So once they're sealed, you're gonna hear that pop, and that's sealing down your food. So I'll show y'all the next day when we come back and look at these how to tell if they actually did seal. But you're gonna immediately, probably within the next 5 or 10 minutes, start hearing pop, 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 that popping noise of your jar sealing. And that's just the most satisfying noise to me, especially going through all this effort to can our food and putting in this much work and time to hear that seal pop. It's such a rewarding sound. So again, I have a mess here to clean up, but it's okay. All of my other jars were perfectly fine. They're just very messy with tomato sauce. I have to wash out my pressure canner, but it's okay. Failures and mistakes like this happen. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Just keep trying. This may happen to you on your first try and you may want to give up, but please don't, because this is such a rewarding thing to be able to provide food for your family like this. It's so helpful to your budget. And as I mentioned in other videos, you don't have to grow all this food to can. You can buy tomatoes at the farmer's market and make sauce like this. You can buy tomatoes at the grocery store and make sauce like this. You don't have to grow these foods to actually use a pressure can or a water bath can. So I will come back and talk to y'all tomorrow once we get these jars cleaned up and labeled. Good morning and welcome to the next morning. We're having a torrential downpour, so hopefully you can hear me over the rain and the thunder. But I wanted to show y'all my jars. You probably saw in the last clip, I had a bit of a canning fail. We're gonna check and see if these sealed. I heard them popping after I opened the lid and saw that failure. So basically the lid came off, the contents went all across my canner and are now all over my other jars. So we're gonna get these washed off. I am gonna go ahead and remove the rings. You don't actually need to store your jars with the rings on, because if there is a defective lid and one of the seals becomes compromised, it's very difficult to tell, or you probably won't tell if you have this ring on it covering it. So I keep my jars down in my basement. So most people probably don't check their jars every day. I don't check my jars every day. So if you notice when you go down and you haven't been around your jars in a while, you notice the seal is compromised, you're going to want to throw that out, because you don't actually know how long this seal has been compromised. Now, if I notice that one of these seals is not on well, I'll just pop it in my fridge and still use it. It hasn't been sitting out long enough to actually spoil. But if it's sitting down in your storage or wherever you store your canned goods, and it's been several days, maybe even months, and you don't actually know how long this has been compromised, you will want to throw the food out, because it will not be safe to eat any longer. So to check your seals, I take off the rings and then I lift with just the edges of my fingertips on that jar, and if it does not come off, it's good. Now, I've had several that did not seal, and you'll know pretty quickly if it's not sealed. So you can also tap the top. It sounds very much like tin. That means it's sealed. If it sounds hollow, let me show you a jar that's not sealed. If it sounds hollow like that, you'll know that it did not seal. You'll also be able to tell that this button is not popped up. So my jars are a little bit of a mess on top, but I can still see that this is very tight and pressed in, and it sounds like tin. So I'm gonna get that cleaned up and then label these. Let's go ahead and check the rest of these jars. This one is good. I'm checking these very carefully since I had that explosion. And sometimes when you have an explosion, which I haven't had an explosion like that, but I've had a jar not seal and the contents did leak a little. When you get those remnants of that food under there, sometimes that can cause the seal to be compromised. These are all good. I'm gonna get them cleaned up and labeled and put down in our storage.